Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started momentarily. I see people are still trickling in. But as we do that, I just want to start with a little introduction. So thank you all if you're here today. You're here for our strategies for recognizing and working with survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, and the Violence Against Women Act training series. So that is a mouthful. There's a lot going on there. So we're starting off the training series today with a live training. Because we have quite a few people, I'm going to ask that everyone stay on mute unless you're speaking, just to minimize background noise. So we're starting up, sorry, ignore the June 2021, that is confusing. We are in 2022. We're starting off with a live training brought to us by Community Solutions. We're so happy to have Perla here lead that portion. I'll let her introduce herself momentarily. But as I said, there's quite a lot in this program. So today we start off with our live training, which is on an intersectional approach to gender-based violence. We hope you'll join us on the 14th for the second live training, also led by Community Solutions, on supporting survivors of sexual assault and human trafficking. And then, as we mentioned in the emails, we are now launching a learning management software system. So there are, in addition to our live training, some e-learning courses. Those courses you take at your own pace, and they're online through Bridge. So if you're here, that means you successfully registered and enrolled in the program. So you should have access to a course on state and federal policies, and also a course on local COC policies. And then there are 2 checkpoints, and both of those checkpoints require some additional evidence. So you need to upload your answers onto the checkpoint, and then I review them and I approve it, and then you get certification for this course. So this is the first time that we're launching a course with all of these features, and that's to say, you know, there might be some hiccups and some transition challenges, but we're absolutely here for any questions you have. So please feel free to email us if any of those parts are feeling confusing. But we're very happy to see you here today for our first live training. And I don't want to spend too much time because I know Perla and some other special guests have a lot to share today. So I just want to quickly cover some Zoom logistics. So as I said, because there are quite a few of us today, we want to just minimize background noise and have everyone stay on mute if possible, if you're not asking a direct question. We do absolutely want you to engage and ask questions. So please pop those in the chat box, which you should be able to see in your menu toolbar. As indicated by the screenshot, you won't have as many options, but there will be a chat box. If you're having tech issues, please feel free to directly message me. We can troubleshoot any of that. I want to let you know that this training is recorded. We post the recording and the slide deck. All of the materials are always posted on the COC training website, and we send you an email letting you know when those materials are uploaded. And there's going to be closed captioning available. So if you hit transcript, you should be able to get subtitles. So with that being said, I just want to welcome you all again. Thank you all for being here. And if you could familiarize yourselves with the chat box, just pop in the chat box your name, your organization, and what helps you get in the flow. Personally, I think having a snack helps me get in the flow because I'm not distracted about being hungry. It just gets me in a good mood, and then I'm ready to learn or focus in on any project. So with that being said, my name is Nicole Thomas. I'm from Homebase. We're a technical assistance provider, and we put on trainings on behalf of the Office of Supportive Housing. And today's training is being led by Community Solutions, and I'll hand it over to Perla.
Thank you, Nicole. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I believe today we're going for from 2 to 4. Is that correct, Nicole?
Yes, that's correct.
And we'll try to take a 5-minute break in between. So I want to start sharing my screen just because we do, and I have to apologize from the beginning because this is going to be so much information. I really want this to feel like a collaborative presentation. So please feel free to ask any questions that you have. And we're going to be spending some time today talking about an intersectional approach to gender-based violence, and also talking about domestic violence, also known as intimate partner violence and intimate partner abuse. And at our next training, we'll go into depth around sexual assault and human trafficking. So we're hoping that as a result of attending this workshop today, we'll have a review again of the different forms and intersections of gender-based violence, better understanding of the services, protections, rights, and legal remedies for intimate partner abuse survivors, and also a better understanding of the role of advocates and the referral process so that you're able to comfortably refer survivors that you might come in contact with. A little bit of information about Community Solutions. We're a multi-service organization founded in 1973, and we provide services in San Benito County and Santa Clara County. Here's our mission. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. And we provide a wide array of services around prevention, intervention, residential services, supporting individuals with mental health issues, substance abuse issues, trauma, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and human trafficking. So my name is Perla. I'm not sure if I share. I'm a senior division director for Community Solutions, and I have been with the agency since 2003, and overseeing intimate partner abuse services, which Community Solutions has served survivors of intimate partner abuse since 1978, and sexual assault services, which we have provided since 1981. And then in 2003, we extended existing services to survivors of human trafficking. And for us, it's really important to take an intersectional approach to gender-based violence. Unfortunately, the way that our funding is set up, a lot of times these issues are addressed as silos, as though they're mutually exclusive of each other, and they're not. So we address gender-based violence in the way that focuses on the root causes of gender-based violence, which is toxic patriarchal socialization and power and control, and really looking at the different types of forms of gender-based violence that someone might experience. And I've listed some of them here in this slide. And our goal in the last several years has really been to shift from those silos and supporting survivors of intimate partner abuse, separate from any issues they might have with sexual assault, labor trafficking, or sex trafficking, and supporting survivors in a way that feels intersectional and comprehensive and holistic. And so there's a lot of reasons why it's so important for us to screen for those different intersections and forms of gender-based violence. And one is we want to make sure that we are addressing all the different types of trauma that survivors may have experienced. And we want to make sure that survivors are also able to explore all the different possible protections, legal remedies, and social benefits that are available to them, because unfortunately, sometimes the type of immigration relief, perhaps, or social service benefits that a survivor can, a foreign-born survivor can link to is really dependent on what type of victimization they experience. The other piece is to connect survivors to other services and programs based on their individual needs and eligibility, and also to connect survivors to the legal services that they might need based on their individual situation. We work very closely with immigration attorneys, family law, employment law, housing attorneys, and also attorneys that focus on social service benefits. Several years ago, Community Solutions is also one of the founding members of the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. And the coalition has 4 committees. We'll talk more about this during our human trafficking training, but just to give you a little bit of context, we do have a victim services committee. And back in 2016, the victim services committee came together and developed what we call the victim needs screening tool. And the purpose of this tool is to identify if survivors that are coming in perhaps for domestic violence issues, perhaps for sexual assault, to identify if that individual also has current or past incidences of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or sexual assault. And again, the purpose is to really support survivors in a way that's more intersectional. And all of the confidential service providers that are part of our coalition, including Asian Americans for Community Involvement and the YWCA, are committed to completing these victim needs screening tools with all of the survivors over the age of 18. One thing I'll mention very quickly is that we also took the victim needs screening tool, which is about 17 questions, and we condensed it. So you might be familiar with the condensed victim needs screening tool, which is administered when somebody's, we've trained a lot of the housing providers so that when a case manager, prior to administering the VICTIMIZATIONS, the case manager will administer the condensed victim needs screening tool to identify if one of their clients could potentially be a past or current survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. And if that individual could be perhaps the survivor, then they're given the option of going into the confidential queue instead of going to the traditional mainstream queue, and also are given the option to be connected to confidential service providers for domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. The service philosophies that we ascribe to are listed here. Trauma-informed is very important to us. Survivor-centered, empowerment-based, and also culturally responsive. So I believe you're all going to have copies of this presentation, so I won't spend a whole lot of time with this piece, but I do want to go into our next section, which talks about being culturally responsive. And it's really important for us to support survivors in a way that's not just responsive to their linguistic needs, but also responsive to the different nuances that could come up with different cultures. So I've invited today Isaira. Isaira is one of our promotoras. Community Solutions has been using the promotora model for about 7 years. And the promotora model is a peer educator model. And the purpose of promotoras is to bring information into their communities, or in this case, around issues of gender-based violence. They also serve as liaisons between their communities and our services, as navigators, as advocates, and also as interpreters. And so Isaira has been a promotora with Community Solutions for over, I think at this point, for about 6 years. Very proud of the work that she does. Isaira is working both in San Benito County and raising awareness about issues of gender-based violence. And Isaira and a couple of her other promotoras that are speak Triqui, they're from Oaxaca in Mexico. And in Mexico, there's still several dialects that are spoken. And so it's really important for Community Solutions serving San Benito County, where there's a large Triqui community, to make sure that we can develop those partnerships with that community so that survivors will feel comfortable accessing services. So Isaira has done a tremendous work. The first year after Isaira and our Triqui speaking promotora started doing outreach in San Benito County, we saw the number of referrals or survivors that were coming in for services into our San Benito office increase by over 200%. So tremendous work that they're doing. Isaira, ¿me escuchas? ¿Estás aquí? We're gonna,
Sí, te escucho, Perla.
¿Puedes prender tu cámara, por favor?
Sí.
Ok, muchas gracias. Ok, so entonces estaba compartiendo un poco acerca de ti y del trabajo que tú haces como promotora, pero si quieres compartir un poco acerca de ti, quién eres, alguna cosa que quieras tú que sepan los participantes hoy en este entrenamiento acerca de ti.
Ok, gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Isaira Hernández Cárdenas. Tengo aquí viviendo 15 años en Jalisco y soy promotora de Community Solution. Soy nacida de Oaxaca, un pueblito se llama San Miguel Arcángel Copala. Mi lengua materna es Triqui. Y pues a mí me encanta conocer ese programa de Community Solution porque me hizo siento más segura conociendo, porque antes no tenía nada de confianza con nadie. Yo vine amenazada de mi pueblo, pero aquí con esta agencia me hizo como que tengo camino libre. Y ahorita estoy muy afortunada de conocer esta agencia.
Voy a interpretar eso que dijiste. Muchas gracias. Muy bueno. So Isaira Hernandez has been living in Hollister for 15 years. She has been a promotora with Community Solutions. She was born in Oaxaca in San Miguel Arcángel, and her native language is Triqui. So she shared that she has loved to learn more about the services offered by Community Solutions and the other programs that are available, because she wasn't aware of these resources, and she also had a really hard time trusting in service providers because when she came here from her native country, she was under threat. And so she feels now that she can once again trust in service providers. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get the interpretation feature working, but we're gonna work here, and I'm sure probably a lot of you speak Spanish. Isaira, ¿quieres compartir un poquito con nosotros por qué te hiciste promotora?
Porque yo quiero ayudar a los demás de la comunidad, como yo he vivido en casos como de violencia doméstica, tráfico humano, y yo la verdad, a mí me gusta ayudar a las personas, no quiero que estén como yo estaba antes. A mí me encanta ayudar y lo que se ocupa, lo que se necesite, pues traducirlas, pues ahí estoy.
Muchas gracias. So I asked Isaida why she likes to be a promotora, why she's a promotora. And she said that she wants to she loves helping other people. She wants to help individuals that are living similar situations as to what she experienced, domestic violence and human trafficking. And that she wants individuals to have the support and resources that they need so that they're not in the same situation that she was in. Isaira, ¿nos puedes compartir un poco acerca de quizá alguno de los casos que tú hayas apoyado de sobrevivientes que quizá al principio no querían, tenían temor de buscar apoyo y que pudiste vincularlo con servicios? So I'm asking Isaira if she can share a case study of someone that she worked with that was reluctant to access services, and then Isaira was able to support to link to resources.
Sí, Perla. Lo que he ayudado a varias personas es de violencia doméstica y tráfico humano y acoso sexual. Son los que he podido ayudar a traducir. Lo primero es de que las mujeres como nosotras indígenas, hay muchas mujeres son cerradas, como no tienen miedo de que, como todas, casi de mayoría de las mujeres son amenazadas. A la verdad no somos de que vamos y decimos, no, tenemos que ver primero, todo el tiempo tenemos que andar con el miedo por las amenazas de los hombres, porque ellos siempre quieren ser machistas, no todos, ¿verdad? Pero de tantos hombres hay que son machistas, te amenazan si les dices yo te pego, yo te mato, o amenaza con la familia. Es por eso que las mujeres no son abiertamente para decir lo que tienen, lo que les pasa. Nomás miran, pero ellas nunca, aunque les peguen, aunque así, pero ellos nunca hablan por el miedo.
Muchas gracias. So Isaida says she's worked with a lot of survivors and of domestic violence and human trafficking and also sexual assault. And that in her community, and particularly with Indigenous women, many are really cut off and are not aware of what resources are available. And they're also often afraid because there's, the majority and a lot of women that are being threatened and so are, being threatened with different and are fearful of the threats to that their partner's going to kill them, because their partner will say, if you tell anybody what's happening at home, I'm going to kill you, or they're threatening them to have them, hurt the kids. And so that it's really difficult and she wants to make it clear that not all men in her community are machista, but those that are, it's really difficult for women to seek that support because of that constant, the fear because of the constant threats. ¿Quieres compartir acerca de quizá alguna sobreviviente que tú has ayudado que ahora ya está en un lugar seguro? And so I'm asking Isaida if she can share about a survivor that she supported that might be in a better place and a safe place now.
Pues sí, de hecho, la señora que ayudé, la verdad, ella está muy contenta. Ahora sí dice, ¿por qué yo no supe eso? O muchas, o sea, ella no entendía español antes tampoco, ahorita ya entiende, pero no, o sea, 100%, ¿verdad? Como nosotros que nos complicamos mucho en español con inglés. Pues la mujer está muy segura donde está ahorita porque ella dice, tengo una que me va a ayudar, que me va a apoyar. Cualquier cosa yo te digo y yo te tengo mucha confianza y como yo les digo, yo te ayudo, pero este es confidencial porque yo quiero cuidar mi trabajo. Y yo, la verdad, yo primero agarro confianza con ellas también y ellas a mí. Y así entre ella y yo, pues ya comunicamos a personal, a veces por teléfono, y es lo que le da gusto a ella porque sabe que no estoy allá ni acá, como, o sea, hablando con cualquier persona. Y es lo que ella agarró la confianza conmigo y diciendo, ya estoy segura porque estoy con una persona que está ayudando en la comunidad.
Oh, okay. So,
Ujú,
muchas gracias. So
ujú.
Isara has shared about several other survivors that she supported, and she said one woman in particular that she's been working with has told her that she feels very happy that this woman also didn't speak even Spanish. She's just a monolingual Triqui speaker, so she's been learning to speak a little bit more Spanish, and has shared with Isaida that she feels very secure where she is now, and she feels very supported now that she's connected to resources. And Isaida, another thing that I didn't share, Isaida, some of our promotoras have taken our 70-hour advocate training so that they can offer confidentiality to survivors. And so that's very helpful. Isaida has shared that because she can stress to the individuals that she works with, that she can maintain that confidentiality that really helps to build the trust and to continue to provide that. So survivors are open to continuing to work with Isaida through peer counseling and also be linked to resources. Muchas gracias, Isaida. Te voy a pedir que te quedes aquí y entonces si hay, te va a estar interpretando Stephanie y si cualquier momento quieres añadir algo, solamente empieza a hablar. Okay.
Ok, ya está bien. Gracias.
So I was just letting Isaida know that if she's going to stay here with us for the presentation, so that if at any time she wants to share, that she has somebody interpreting for her, so she'll pop in and share with us. So I want to share with you Rosana, which obviously we changed the name for confidentiality reasons. And Rosana is the first human trafficking survivor that I worked with when I started working at Community Solutions. Unfortunately, Rosana she lived in Oaxaca and she met her father for the first time when she was 14. And basically her father showed up to say that a man that accompanied her father, let's just say his name was Jose, who was in his 40s, had purchased Rosana, and that Rosana was to do whatever this gentleman wanted her to do. And so Jose took Rosana, brought her to the US, ended up taking her to Georgia. She didn't speak Spanish at that time either. She was monolingual Triqui speaking, but that she caught that Georgia. She heard that's why she knew that that's the state that she had been taken into. And so for the next, couple of years, Jose proceeded to rape Rosana, to beat her, and to force her to work in his home and business without any pay. And so as you heard about Rosana's story, and you could put this in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute, feel free to share. What are some of the red flags that came up for you when you're listening to Rosana's story? And I'm going to see if anybody, I don't think I have access to the chat, but there's a couple of chats here. And again, if you want to share, feel free to also to speak. And then also, what are some of Rosana's vulnerabilities? What are some factors about Rosana that would make her more vulnerable to any type of abuse? Somebody put in language barrier. Absolutely. The language barrier is huge. The age, she was so young. She was 14 years old, and the man that she was sold to was in his 40s. Yeah. So, and then what forms of victimization did you identify? What types of violence were happening? Yeah, the fact that she was sold, that's a huge red flag. She was in a new place. She didn't know anyone or the language. Yes, she had human trafficking, sexual abuse, physical abuse. She was raped and beaten, all kinds of violence and violations, domestic and sexual abuse. Child abuse, yes, good one. Yes, somebody caught that there was child abuse because she was under the age of 18. This is the reason why it was so important for us to do this intersectional screening. And when Rosana was referred to us, she actually, when she was about 16, 17 years old, she was able to escape this gentleman, go back home to Oaxaca. And then about a week or two after she'd returned home, her dad showed up again with a gun, basically telling her, I'm not going to refund this guy his money, so you better go with him. And she was able to convince her dad, yes, I'm going to go with him. But with the help of family and friends, instead had saved up a little bit of money and came to the US and ended up in Hollister this time. So Rosana was connected to us because she was working with a public health nurse and had gotten really sick. And so when she shared her story with the public health nurse identified that there was domestic violence, but didn't realize that there was also human trafficking and sexual assault. And so since there was human trafficking, Rosana was able, we connected her to an immigration attorney who was able to get her a T visa. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Rosana went through the process of having a T visa, adjusting to legal permanent resident, and she's a citizen at this point. So that's why it's so important that we're able to identify all those different intersections of gender-based violence, and also to offer her the support around the trauma that's really specific to what she endured. Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure why my. Okay, so and the victimizations, intimate partner abuse, sexual assault, labor trafficking, and child sexual abuse. So again, today we're going to focus on intimate partner violence, but I just thought it's really important for us to go into this series thinking intersectionally. And as you hear more about sexual assault, human trafficking, also be thinking about what are other intersections or other forms of abuse that come up. And in terms of intimate partner abuse, we know approximately 2 to 4 million women are physically assaulted by their partner per year in the US, and that's physical assault. So that's not even counting verbal, mental abuse, isolation, financial abuse. Attacks by male partners are the #1 cause of injury to women between the ages of 15 to 44. And also 1 of every 3 women will be a victim of violence by a husband or boyfriend at some point in her lifetime. I also want to make sure that I put this out there that definitely intimate partner abuse also happens where there's males that are victims and female perpetrators. And it also happens in the LGBTQ community. So we don't want to minimize that. But because the overwhelming cases of domestic violence that we see is a female victim with a male perpetrator, that's why our presentation is set up in this way. But definitely we have had. In fact, I'll say that about 10% of our clients that we serve per year of intimate partner abuse are males, survivors of either female or male perpetrators. Okay, so a little bit more statistics. Nearly 1 in 4 adult women and 1 in 7 adult men report having experienced severe physical violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. And 10% of women, 2% of men report having been stalked by an intimate partner. And intimate partner violence alone affects more than 12 million people every year. So that, again, this includes all gender orientations, gender identities, and sexual orientations. So when we think about what is intimate partner abuse, and I know that for a long time we use the term domestic violence, and we're really trying to move away from that because domestic violence can also include anything that happens in the home, any kind of abuse. So it could be between partners, it could be a parent abusing a child, it could be a sibling abuse, and it could also be a child abusing a parent. But we're talking specifically about, when we say intimate partner abuse, a pattern of abusive behaviors that are exerted by one individual in order to first exert and then maintain power and control over their partner in the context of an intimate relationship. And we use the term abuse instead of violence because sometimes the tactics that are used are not necessarily physical violence, but they are obviously forms of abuse. So emotional abuse, for example, psychological, verbal, sexual abuse, financial abuse, isolation. Let me go back for a second. And for those of you, because I'm sure, unfortunately, based on the statistics, most of us know someone that was a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner abuse, and whether that's through work or in our personal lives. Can you think of any other tactics, and you could drop them in the chat, that you've heard of different tactics that a perpetrator might use to exert and then maintain power and control over their partner? If we think about Vanessa's situation, Rosana's situation, the survivor that we just, the 14-year-old, what other tactics do you think that Jose was using to control Rosana? Let's see if we have anything here in the chat. So with Rosana, we definitely saw that there was physical abuse. There was emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Isolation is huge. Financial, she didn't have access to any of the money or resources. Yes, fear. And financial abuse. Absolutely, those are huge. And then if you heard also from what Isaida was sharing with us earlier, she talked a lot about the threats of I'm going to kill you if you go to anybody, about the threats around I'm going to take the kids away from you if you go to anybody. So threats are also a huge factor, and the different power and control dynamics or tactics that abusive individuals will use. Okay. Let's go here to the next one. So some examples of abusive behavior, obviously with physical abuse, any kind of hitting, beating. I'm sorry, something's going funky with my computer. Strangling. And in fact, we actually have Santa Clara County in late 2019, the county funded a pilot so that the San Jose Police Department, it was three law enforcement agencies, the San Jose Police Department, the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office, and I forgot the third agency. When they came across a survivor, they respond to a domestic violence call, and that survivor said that they had been strangled by their partner. With this pilot, that survivor could receive a free medical exam, forensic exam, because there's such the aftermath of being strangled, just the repercussions can be so severe. And as part of this pilot, the survivor would also have a confidential advocate that could go with them to the strangulation exam. And I really push for also allowing advocates to offer the exam to survivors, because in looking at our data, the survivors are more likely to share with their advocate, their confidential advocate, that they were strangled by their partner. So that pilot has now become a permanent program for our county. So if you are ever working with a survivor and that person shares with you that they were strangled, please reach out to us, and we're happy to talk to that person about this exam. That's really important, because strangulation is once a survivor goes in to talk to a medical provider and they disclose that they have been sexually assaulted or that they were abused by their partner, the medical provider has to report that to law enforcement. So often that's a huge deterrent for survivors. So there have been survivors that the only reason they went in to have the exam was because we had one survivor that couldn't breathe. Like, it was days after she was having difficulty breathing. But we still think it's very important for survivors to know. And unfortunately, they have to choose, between the lesser of two evils. But we think it's really important for survivors to know what could be the repercussions of being strangled, and then what the resources are, the services, and what will happen if that individual seeks the support. We also, obviously, pushing, shoving, slapping, kicking, pulling hair, any types of physical contact. Sexual abuse, any type of forced sexual activity, from rape to unwelcome touching. And a lot of times we see a lot of coercion also that happens in terms of coercing somebody, pressuring them into having unwanted sex. When we looked at the intersection screening tool, we ran a report of several victim need screening tools that we completed with survivors. And we found that about 40% of domestic violence survivors disclosed that they had also been sexually assaulted by their partner. So it's really important that we're addressing the sexual abuse as well. Emotional abuse, we see this quite often: name calling, insulting the survivor. I'm sorry, this thing is just, it won't click once and then it clicks twice. Any type of, humiliating somebody, making the person feel guilty, playing head games or crazy making, what we could call, there's a term for that. So we have survivors will share with us very often that they'll have their partner make them feel like they're the one that's crazy, that they're gaslighting, I think is the term. So that's something that happens often. Isolation is huge, whether that's holding somebody against their will or preventing them from leaving, like in ROSANA'S situation, or not letting that individual contact their friends or family, not allowing them access to the telephone or their vehicle. Those are huge. Let me see, there's some stuff in the chat here. Gaslighting, yes, thank you. Thank you. Gaslighting is definitely that term. And then with regards to isolation, we've had clients that we worked with. I had one client in particular who they had an arranged marriage, and she was from India. They both were. So her partner went to India, brought her back here. And once she got here, she realized that she wasn't being brought in to marry this guy. She was being brought in to serve as a nanny and a maid for him and he already had a fiance. And so her gentleman was living with his parents, and that's where the survivor was brought in to live. And the entire family was abusive to her. But what happened is that he took away her laptop. And so he would log in as her and would send emails back to her home saying, Mom, Dad, I'm so happy, everything is great. And so there's definitely some very sophisticated isolation strategies that we've seen. With this particular survivor, the only reason she was able to get away is that on one occasion, Mom was really upset that she didn't like the way that the survivor had cooked. And so she burned the survivor with hot oil, and survivor ran out of the house, was able to call the police. And then we were able to, bring her into our shelter. Because of the situation, it was fraud, since she had told us she was told she was coming in to be married, to have this family life, and in fact was being brought in for labor purposes. She was also able to apply for a T visa. Okay, let's go to this one. We see a lot, we talked about the threats, the intimidation, and particularly for survivors with children, yeah, it keeps doing that. I'm so sorry. I keep skipping. So for survivors with children, that is a huge concern for them. And then also threats to harm children, family member, pets. We hear that one quite a bit. Damaging property when the person is angry, punching walls, kicking doors, and that's all threatening behavior, and it's rather effective. So a lot of the survivors that we work with, they don't suffer as much physical abuse, but these threats and the other tactics, because those don't leave any kind of mark on the survivor, so it's harder to prove that there was intimate partner violence. And again, the using the children is huge. And it could be threatening to take the children away, or making accusations of the person being a bad or unfit parent. We've seen that several cases of that. Threatening to harm the children, using the child's feelings as a way of control, and then making the child take sides during an argument. One of the things, marital rape, and I just shared that about 40% of the domestic violence survivors that participated and completed a victim needs screening tool reported that they had been sexually assaulted by their partner. And it's interesting because historically that marital rape was not considered a crime. It was, and so if you look at the penal codes now in California, there's one penal code for spousal rape and then one for rape. And so a lot of times survivors that we work with are not aware that, or are surprised to learn that they do have the right to not have sex, even if the person is, is their spouse. And we also have seen with survivors that in terms of marital rape, they're more likely to encounter this type of rape when they're in the process of wanting to leave that relationship, because it's a way for the abuser to exert that power and control over their partner. And a lot of times survivors might be reluctant to report. And particularly, obviously, again, with like with domestic violence, sexual assault, so something has to be reported to law enforcement if the survivor seeks medical care. So a lot of times when we work with survivors that were raped by their husbands and they don't want to report, but they're concerned that they might get STDs or have an unwanted pregnancy, then we explore other options with them. You're gonna have to The other option would be to go to your medical provider and say that you had unprotected sex and are concerned about, an STD or unwanted pregnancy. And unfortunately, that's the option that they have right now because of the mandated medical reporter laws. And with survivors of marital rape, unfortunately, they're more likely to be raped multiple times and to suffer long-lasting physical and psychological injuries because of that ongoing sexual abuse. Okay. So every case of intimate partner abuse is different. We don't use a cookie cutter approach with any individual that we work with. And some of the things that we've heard from survivors, some of the frequent themes that we hear is that often survivors feel that their partner is like two different people, that they feel like they're living with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that they feel like their partner's never happy with anything that they do. They feel like they're walking on eggshells and never knowing like when the other shoe's going to drop, that they feel that their partner messes with their minds sometimes to make them feel like in gaslighting, make them feel like they're going crazy, and that they feel like they don't know why they set off their partner. They don't know, they know that they set off their partner. They take that, they feel that that's their responsibility. They feel guilty about it, and they don't know what they're doing wrong. And obviously it's not their fault, right? And then we also get asked really frequently, why don't victims just leave? If they're going through all this, physical abuse or having somebody control who they can hang out with, if they can, what they can eat, what they can wear, why wouldn't they just leave that situation? And so there's many, many, many reasons. And again, every situation is different, but these are just some general themes that we've heard from survivors. Fear is a huge one, and fear of many different things. It could even be fear of losing a familiar surrounding, of not knowing where to go, like particularly for survivors that are foreign born, that were brought here by their partners and don't have perhaps friends or family in the area. Or it could be fear of having family or friends know that my marriage didn't work out, or fear of I just worked with a survivor recently that he didn't want anybody to know that he's gay. And so that was his fear of that information coming out. Sometimes survivors begin to feel that the abuse is normal, particularly if growing up they saw abuse in their home. And a big reason is love. And I think that that's one that we cannot minimize, or because when somebody, abusive behavior is behavior that is learned. And so it doesn't mean that the person is a bad person. And it doesn't mean that, the survivors are in love with the person and the behavior is what's wrong. And it's sometimes really, really hard to tease those two apart. Concern for children and lack of financial resources are huge factors for survivors. Okay. And then the other thing that we see is pressure from family and friends, pressure to make it work. I knew I was going to do that. So pressure to make the relationship work. And particularly because a lot of times individuals that are abusive, they're not abusive. They don't show that side of themselves to friends or family. And so from the person that is the perpetrator, the way that they behave in front of other people is very different. And so the survivor might be getting pressure like, well, you're the one that's not making this work. Your partner is such a great person. Embarrassment or shame, a lack of support networks is a huge. Language barriers, as we heard from Isaida, that she's had clients that are still monolingual, Triqui speaking. It's really hard to go and seek out resources, cultural or religious reasons. And I'm gonna ask Isaida. Isaida, ¿me estás escuchando? I'm going to ask Isaida to share a little bit with us in the Triqui community, some of those customs that might make it difficult for survivors to leave their partner. ¿Estás aquí, Isaida? Oh, she might have stepped away for a little bit. So we'll come back. But there are definitely, specific nuances to culture that we want to be really, really thoughtful around. So and if Isaida comes back, I'll ask her to expand a little bit more. But we have worked with survivors. There's one particular survivor that stands out for me. That's also from Oaxaca, Triqui speaker. and one of our promotoras helped with the interpretation. So this survivor, her partner was her husband was really abusive to her, and the neighbor, and they live here in Greenfield. The neighbor called the police, and so the gentleman was arrested and he was taken to jail. And so back home, back in Oaxaca, the tribal leaders blamed the wife, blamed the victim, and were basically going to kidnap her parents until he was released from jail. So I had to write a letter, and that's where our promoters are really helpful, because they're also cultural brokers in a way for us. I had to write a letter explaining that the survivor did not call the police, that she did not, it's not up to her to press charges because of the way that the system is set up here. And the other piece that was really helpful, the prosecutor in this case was also really helpful, because the prosecutor knew the situation and made sure to say in court multiple times, you don't want to be here. You don't want to testify. And because there's also community members that would go to court and that report back to Oaxaca what was happening. So it's really helpful to have again, side of the promotoras that really understand some of those cultural or religious reasons why somebody is not able to leave an abusive relationship. Like we talked about fear of being outed, and then physical limitations. We have worked with survivors that perhaps are might have some type of disability and either rely on their partner for that for support, or perhaps financially wouldn't be able to manage if their partner was not in the picture. So you might all be familiar with the power and control wheel. And this is what we use in working with survivors to explain how intimate partner abuse is all about exerting and maintaining power and control, and the different tactics that are used to that end. And that could include, again, all the different, what we've talked about, the coercion, threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, minimizing, denying, and blaming is a very common tactic that somebody that's abusive will use. So minimizing, it wasn't that bad, you should have seen how my dad used to beat my mom. Or denying, like, you're crazy, I never touched you. Or blaming, like, well, you know that I don't like when you go visit your friend and Rebecca, and you did it, so this really is your fault. Using the children, using male privilege, using economic abuse is a huge one as well. And there's also, over the years, there's been development of power and control wheels to address specific communities. So for example, with the immigrant community, in addition to all the standard power and control, the tactics that are used to exert and maintain power and control, there's an additional layer of barriers and different tactics that perpetrators could use to exert and continue maintaining that power and control. And I don't know if this is super legible, but I'm also happy to send this to you. A huge one that we hear all the time is threatening, particularly for survivors that are undocumented, is threatening that survivor. I'm going to call immigration and have you deported. We also have, in MARITAL, it's a domestic violence service provider. I think I have their phone number here. And the reason that MARITAL works primarily with the Salvation community, and that organization was formed in the late 80s to address this huge issue where a lot of professional men coming from India, and they were here on work visas, and they're bringing their wives with them, but the wife essentially had no status and had no recourse. So if her husband left her, then she automatically becomes undocumented and then deportable. And so for that reason, there's MARITAL is their focus is really around transitional housing and then the legal support. So those pieces are really important. We have survivors they're brought here, their fiance, visa, or once they're here, and that's something that perpetrators will hold over their head quite a bit of, I'm not going to adjust you, I'm not going to help you adjust to becoming a legal permanent resident. So that's another huge mechanism for control. And then again, in other communities, like the LGBTQ community, there's other tactics that are specific to that community that perpetrators will utilize to exert and maintain power and control over their partner. And a lot of that is external, that there's homophobia, heterosexism. So it can be very challenging for somebody that's in an LGBTQ relationship to seek out support. I'm going to check the chat here real quick. Yes, Tony shared, it's really hard for many men who are abused by women. Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think for many reasons, it's harder for men to seek support. And particularly, I would say in the Latino community where the men's supposed to be in charge. And so I agree with you. It's really the men that we've worked with, because I mentioned about 10% of our clients in any given year are male survivors of intimate partner abuse. And again, it could be by women, or it could be, survivors of a same-sex relationship. But there is a huge challenge for men to seeking support. We also find, by law, shelters are supposed to provide the same resources to men and women. But the reality is that, like our shelter, for example, it's set up for women. So we can't bring in men to our confidential shelter, and we would accommodate with hotel and support. But definitely it's, I think, it's really challenging. So I would also really encourage, if you know any male survivors, they can reach out for resources confidentially. There are agencies, all of our services are available to anybody of any gender identity. And there are agencies like Next Door Solutions to Domestic Violence that have support groups specific for men. We don't have that kind of volume in terms of, so we would refer our clients to, that would leverage other resources that exist. And so when we think about a healthy relationship, I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect relationship, but there are healthy relationships, and healthy relationships really center around equality and, behavior that's non-threatening, respect, trust, and support. And what I like to do with the survivors that I work with, because I'm not here to, I've had survivors ask me, am I a domestic violence victim? That's not for me to say. It's not for me to say, you're the expert of your relationship. So we really try to focus more on the positive. And so what I would share with somebody that's really struggling with whether or not they're in a relationship that's abusive is that I would share the equality wheel. And we have a conversation about, is the behavior in your relationship non-threatening? Is there respect? Is there trust and support? Is there, the shared responsibility, economic partnership? And that helps an individual identify, like, no, I don't think that's not my situation. So the situation, the relation, and determine for themselves whether their relationship is healthy or not. So in terms of how you can offer support, and again, unfortunately, because of the statistics, either in our personal life or in our professional life, we're going to come across individuals that are experiencing intimate partner abuse. And the best way to support them is to remind them that they don't deserve to be abused, and that definitely the abuse is not their fault. And being available to listen if somebody wants to ask for help, and remembering that it might be really difficult for somebody to share their experience. And I've had many survivors say, because I think that all of us as service providers, speaking for myself, when we're hearing somebody share a difficult situation or something that they're going through, we think that they're asking us to resolve that situation for them, but they're really not. I think that really the important piece is listening and validating. And I've had many survivors say that it was really helpful to feel heard and to feel validated. So that piece is really important. And then encouraging that person to contact a domestic violence agency where they can receive free, confidential, and non-judgmental support. The other piece that we share a lot with survivors, because we work with survivors that leave abusive relationships. We work with survivors that also might stay or return to an abusive relationship. Always support their decisions. It's completely their choice, and we don't want to take the role of the person that's abusing them and now start making decisions for survivors. And so it's really important for us to do safety planning. And so for individuals that decide to stay or have to stay or decide to stay in a situation that's abusive, we help work with them to develop a safety plan. And one of the components of the safety plan model that we use is one that was developed by Jill Davis back like in the mid 1990s. And it's from a book called Safety Planning with Battered Women. We don't use the term battered women anymore, but just the term with and not for. It's really the focus is, or the goal is to develop symmetrical partnerships with survivors where the survivor is the expert of their situation. and their life. And our role is just to offer resources, explore options, share information, and then the survivor will determine what the best steps are for them, but at least with more information and knowing how systems work and what resources are available. The other thing that the safety plan has to include is that the safety plan for what are called batterer-generated risk and life-generated risk. And batterer-generated risks are any risk that are immediately associated with that individual that's being abusive. So whether it's a risk of this person, hurting the individual, kidnapping the children, et cetera. And then life-generated risks are risks that that perpetrator could exploit. So for example, if somebody has a disability, if somebody's legal status, that's not created by the perpetrator, but it's definitely something that the perpetrator could exploit to further hurt the survivor. So we also ask survivors if they have children, be prepared to talk to your kids about the situation, and if it were to escalate, how they can keep themselves safe. And we do safety planning with kids as well that we work with. So I think now might be a good time to take a break, and I'm going to leave it up to Nicole how long of a break we want to take.
5 minutes. It's 3:02, so if we could just call everyone back to their workstations, and then Perla will continue on with the presentation.
Sure. And while we're waiting for folks, and before we move to the next portion of our training, which is around victim rights and resources and services available for survivors, are there any questions about intimate partner violence or anything that we covered during the first part of the presentation? And feel free to unmute yourself, or you could also just put it in the chat. Looks like no. So then we'll get started. So when somebody is a victim of a crime, there are different rights that might attach for that victim at different points. And in California, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with this. You also, again, you'll have this in your presentation. But in California, MARSY'S law establishes all the different provisions for victims of a crime and what their rights are as they're going through that criminal justice process. And so again, this is for any of you that are working with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking that are going through the process, it's really helpful to have this information. And the victim witness advocates do provide this information to any of the survivors once the case, their partners being charged, or there's a police report that's made. So really helpful for survivors to have this information. And again, this will be in your PowerPoint, your handout. The other piece that's so there's a lot of great rights under MARSY'S. There's some rights that are specific to some state rights that are specific to domestic violence survivors. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on that today. One piece that's super helpful for survivors of intimate partner violence, they have the right to have an advocate with them during any follow-up interview with law enforcement, with prosecutors, or with defense attorneys. And the survivor could also choose not to meet with the defense attorneys. And that piece is really helpful. In South County, because we have a South County Family Justice Center, when all follow-up interviews for domestic violence are scheduled here at the Family Justice Center. So that's helpful, because then there's an advocate here that could support the survivor. And so in addition to having an advocate, the survivor could also have a support person of their choosing with them when they go to meet with law enforcement and follow-up interviews or with prosecutors. What's also really helpful is that many times when survivors come to us, they haven't made a police report. They haven't had any law enforcement involvement. And if they choose to make a police report, then their advocate can accompany them to the police department and be there with the survivor to offer that support and advocacy while the survivor files a report. The other piece is that survivors of domestic violence have the right to have an advocate with them when they're going through the court process. And so that pieces can be really helpful. We also provide transportation to court for survivors. With criminal cases, the advocate will serve as a liaison between the survivor and the prosecutor and law enforcement, and the survivor, that's what the survivor wishes. So the advocate will keep the survivor apprised of there's a court hearing coming up, the purpose of the court hearing, and supporting the survivor. If the survivor wants help developing like a victim impact statement, any type of support that the survivor wants through, whether it's a criminal court process or also during a family court process as well.
Carla, there's a question on who connects them to an advocate.
Thank you. That is a great question. So with the when a victim comes, so law enforcement is required to tell survivors, and that's why they give them the little DV resource card. They should be. When the survivor is connected, when the law enforcement interviews a survivor or responds to a domestic violence call, they're required to tell that victim that there's advocacy services, and to provide the information on the resource card so that survivors can reach out to the law enforcement agency. In Santa Clara County, in our domestic violence law enforcement protocol, a few years ago was written in that law enforcement is required to conduct a lethality assessment when they respond to domestic violence cases. And so in that lethality assessment, if there's concern that that survivor is at high lethality, then law enforcement can also offer the survivor to speak over the phone with an advocate, or can bring the survivor back to the police station and have an advocate respond. So it should be, if the survivor has come in contact with law enforcement, then law enforcement is required to inform the survivor of their right to have an advocate, and also of the advocacy agencies. And what's challenging is for survivors that have not, like you heard from Isaida, that a lot of survivors are not aware of the service, especially if they don't have law enforcement involvement. And that's where it's really important that all of our partners are aware of the resources and also referring survivors to services. Did that answer your question? So the other protections for survivors of intimate partner violence, they could request a domestic violence protective order. And this is a civil order that protects the victim from an intimate partner or family member that's being abusive. We do have advocates. We have a couple legal advocates that work with survivors to prepare the restraining order and submit that to court, and then we'll drive the survivor to court, be there with them, provide all that support. Also for survivors that have children, we make sure that they know if you leave your house and you take your children with you, it's very important to follow what's called a good cause report. And this is a report that's done through the district attorney's child abduction unit. And it's basically a report where the survivor is saying, I didn't kidnap my children. I took them because I'm fleeing an abusive environment. And so I took my children with me so that they're not also exposed to abuse. And that is a protection for survivors, because if their partner wants to accuse the survivor of kidnap, then there's that on record and then the survivor, once they file a good cause report, they have about 30 days to actually file either a restraining order or some kind of child custody petition. The other piece that's really for survivors of domestic violence, and when we talk about a confidential advocate, all of the advocates that work for Next Door Solutions to Domestic Violence, Community Solutions, the YWCA, MAITRE, Asian Americans for Community Involvement, are required to go through a training and maintain a certain level of training hours so that we can be able to offer this survivor advocate privilege. So that means that if we're subpoenaed to testify as to what a survivor said to us, we can assert privilege and not be compelled to provide that testimony. And sometimes, or if our records are subpoenaed, then we could also again assert that privilege and hopefully not have to submit that information. And the other protection for survivors of intimate partner abuse is the financial assistance through the Cal VCB board, and that's so survivors can fill out an application with victim witness and to seek financial assistance, whether that is relocation assistance or have their locks changed, if they have any medical expenses that they've incurred as a result of the abuse, that their insurance doesn't pay for, if they miss days from work, those types of situations are able to, if they qualify for victim witness, then they're able to receive that support. Okay. And then survivors of domestic violence, there's certain immigration remedies for foreign-born survivors that are undocumented. So we're not attorneys, and our role is to connect survivors to attorneys. Here, we're very fortunate that there's a nonprofit organization called Step Forward Foundation. And this is a legal nonprofit that's actually they rent space here from Community Solutions in Morgan Hill. And their focus is on supporting survivors of crime for immigration, family law, and they also provide some employment law support. And so our advocates, our role is to connect the survivor. If we do a victim needs screening tool, we identify that a survivor might have immigration needs, then we'll connect them to an immigration attorney. And the attorney will help identify what is the best option for a survivor. And that could include VAWA self-petitions. And this has to be for survivors and their children. We've also had child survivors that went through VAWA to request to do a self-petition. But the survivor has to be legally married to a legal permanent resident or US citizen. So a lot of times that's not an option for us, for the clients that we work with, because either our clients, if they are married, their partner might also be undocumented. So then another option is a U visa. And in this case, again, the survivor doesn't need to be married to the person, or it doesn't matter what the legal status is of the abuser. And a U visa, I think that probably everybody's familiar with that, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. But basically with a U visa, which takes forever for survivors, it's a temporary visa that victims of crime might be eligible for. And once the visa, it takes forever to get it, but once the visa is approved, once a person has a U visa, they can also adjust to legal permanent resident. So it's a huge resource for survivors. Hundreds of survivors that we work with every year apply for U visas, and that's the reason why there's such a backlog, and it's taking forever for those for survivors to obtain that. The other piece, survivors could also apply for asylum, and we've had several survivors where the abuse happened in their home country, and that are able to come in and apply for asylum based on gender-based violence. That changed a little bit under the previous administration, but hopefully it'll go back to being how it was before. And so we do have survivors that, again, they were victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking in their home country, and they're able to apply for that when they come in. And then the T visa is for intimate partner violence when there's a severe form of human trafficking. And so we have had many survivors that were abused by their partner, by their intimate partner, whether they're married or they just have a relationship. And so there might be an opportunity for that individual to also have a T visa. So it's usually immigration attorneys will, if they believe the person qualifies for a T visa, they will submit petitions for both a T visa and a U visa. In case the T visa is not granted, then hopefully the U visa will be granted. There's a question, what agencies can help people in San Mateo County? So San Mateo County, there's CORA, that is the domestic violence service provider. And then there's a sexual assault service provider, RTS, rape trauma services. And I can put in their information in the chat. There's also a national domestic violence hotline. And I'm gonna ask Stephanie, do you mind looking that up, Stephanie, and putting it in the chat? And with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, we use that for when we're trying to help survivors relocate. You can just call the hotline and say, what are the service providers in this city and this state? And the national hotline can connect to that. So we'll see if hopefully Stephanie will put that in the chat. If not before we wrap up, I can provide it or send it to Nicole, who can hopefully share that with everybody. Okay. Okay. So again, the immigration remedies or benefits, we talked about the Violence Against Women Act that might lead to legal permanent residence, and then the ability for the survivor to work and then eventually become a United States citizen. Again, that's not an option for a lot of the survivors that we work with because either they're not married to their partner or their partner perhaps is not a legal permanent resident or a citizen. But under the U visa, the other piece that's really helpful is with the U visa, if the individual is approved, because there aren't any U visas available, and while they're waiting for the U visa to become available, they can receive work authorization. And the other piece that's really helpful about the U visa is that survivors can include derivatives. So if we have survivors of domestic violence that perhaps they have children, minor children that were also born in a different country, they can include their children as derivatives in their petition. If we have survivors that are under 21 and they're not married, they might also be able to petition to include their parents or their siblings that are also minors. And then once somebody actually has the U visa for 3 years, they can then apply to be adjusted to a legal permanent resident. And after being a legal permanent resident for 5 years, then they can adjust to being a citizen. We have also had survivors that adjust, if a survivor marries a US citizen, that obviously not the abuser, hopefully, after being married to a US citizen for 3 years, they can adjust that status to citizen. The T visa also includes derivatives and can include a work permit. And then with the T visa, the same thing, after having the T visa for 3 years, can adjust to legal permanent resident. The other piece that's helpful with the T visa that doesn't exist with the U visa is that the survivor can adjust to legal permanent resident either after having the T visa for 3 years or once the criminal case has been adjudicated. So we've had situations here in our county. So if the DA's office decides they're not going to file charges, then the criminal case is adjudicated. So the survivor can adjust more quickly to a legal permanent resident. Okay, so I know that's a lot.
There's a question in the chat.
Uh-huh.
What if the DV survivor wasn't aware of these resources at the time? Could they still get help years later?
Yes, that's a great question. So the U visa and the T visa were introduced in 2000 with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and we've had survivors. So, but anybody can, even if it's their abuse happened before. We've had survivors that suffered their abuse in the mid-90s and that apply for a U visa. So to be able to be eligible for a U visa, the victim that has to be a victim of a violent crime, and there's the victims that qualifying crimes are enumerated in the U visa. So they include domestic violence, assault, sexual assault, like if you have a family member that was murdered. So they have to be have that qualifying crime that happened here in the US. They have to have been cooperative with law enforcement. And so for all of the U visa petitions require what's called a sub B. And this is basically a certification from law enforcement saying, yes, this person was cooperative. They help with the case. So in our county, if the case is submitted to the district attorney's office, the district attorney's office has a U visa unit, and all they do is review and make sure and then that the person did cooperate. So as long as a person, if they reported it to the police, if they were cooperative and the crime happened here, and then we have to show that the crime impacted them in one way or another, then they could apply for the U visa. So it doesn't, again, there are going to be cases where it's difficult if the person didn't report, or if they did report and ended up not testifying, that might be challenging because they have to meet that requirement of being cooperative with law enforcement. But I would still always encourage survivors to have a free consultation with an attorney. And I'm going to share, because we're fortunate in Santa Clara County, we have 3 family justice centers, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. So any survivor can go into a family justice center and request a free consultation with an immigration attorney. And the immigration attorney will talk to the survivor and figure out if the person is able to apply based on meeting those requirements for the U visa. So our agency provides empowerment-based services to strengthen and support survivors of intimate partner abuse, sexual assault, and human trafficking, also labor trafficking. So if you are working with individuals who are perhaps they're being exploited at work, and it doesn't rise to the level of human trafficking, but there's still some workplace crimes happening, also refer them, because we're able to provide support. We also provide prevention services, education services at schools and the community on these different topics. And USAIDA is a good example of some of our prevention and community outreach efforts. And we try to uphold this advocacy empowerment wheel. And really, again, at the center of this empowerment through advocacy and the components that are really important as respect and confidentiality for the survivors that we work with, believing their experiences. And I know that a lot of these, unfortunately, a lot of these power and controls, they're not, they're very gender specific, and I apologize, we didn't create them. Hopefully they're going to be updated soon. But believing and validating the survivors' experiences, acknowledging the injustice is really important, respecting their autonomy, helping to plan for future safety, and then promoting that access to community services. And that's the reason that we use the promotora model, and particularly in San Benito County, we have Triqui-speaking promotores, because we want to identify and remove all the barriers that could prevent survivors from being aware of the services and then accessing the services. So again, in San Benito, with our Triqui community, the barriers are, the language barrier, lack of the trust barrier, and then concerns about seeking services in a mainstream organization, because they're told all kinds of things. Survivors or community members can be told, if you receive services, this is going to be reported to immigration, or it's going to be a public charge issue. So we're trying to really remove all those barriers so that survivors feel safe and comfortable reaching out for services. And I think you heard USAIDA say that some of the survivors that she's worked with, that she brought up the word trust multiple times, and that's such an important piece. So the role of our advocates, and this is our domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking advocates. There's a lot of things that are involved. Crisis intervention. We do have in-person responses 24/7, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Peer counseling, safety planning, ensuring that survivors' basic needs are met. Some financial assistance, including gift cards for food, gas, clothing. And then we also offer empowerment assistance. We have housing programs, ensuring that survivors have their medical and psychiatric or mental health needs met. Linkage to other providers, advocacy within the criminal justice system, or even advocacy or housing and other spaces. Transportation, goal setting is really important. And then accompaniment, so actually going with survivors to different appointments or court hearings, interviews with law enforcement, prosecutors, etc., and resources and referrals to other services. One thing I will say, the way that our support is set up, for survivors that engage in services, we provide case management and advocacy for an average of 3 to 5 years. And so we've developed a case management model. And I think you saw at the beginning of our presentation, it said inicios, which means beginnings. And that's the name of our case management model. And this model looks at supporting survivors from crisis to stabilization and long-term sustainability. And again, that takes an average of 3 to 5 years, and really looking at 3 specific phases of case management. So during the crisis phase, really our focus, that's like when we first connect with a survivor, and we provide the 24-hour in-person response. If there's need for emergency hotel or shelter, emergency transportation to either a shelter or safe location, food, clothing, medicine, any type of urgent hygiene products. And then linkage to crisis legal support. So the survivor has an urgent legal issue that needs to be addressed. And then linkage to crisis support for mental or medical health care. Then safety planning and goal planning. So during that, and usually the crisis phase lasts about 30 days, 60 days. It depends on the individual survivor. But our focus at that time will only be on the urgent needs. We're not really worrying about like, where's this person going to work? Where are they going to buy a house? Where are they going to live? It's really like, when you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're only focusing at that very basic layer. And then the survivor would graduate into a what we call the stabilization or transitional support phase. And really the focus of the stabilization phase is to, again, identify and remove all the barriers that keep survivors from having gainful employment, from having permanent housing, from, focusing on overcoming the trauma. And that phase can last from 8 months, sometimes up to 2 years. And a lot of it also is contingent on whether the survivor has the ability to work. Because a lot of times, obviously, not able to move forward, they have to have that work permit and have that ability to work. And then once somebody goes into the long-term or the sustainability phase, our goal there is that somebody's already, they've are able to provide for themselves, they're safe emotionally and physically. We want to make sure that they're able to maintain that. We've worked with a lot of survivors, and especially in this area, it's so expensive that it could be that their car breaks down and they have to use the rent money for their car, and now they're might be thrown back into crisis of not having a place to stay. So that's the reason that we provide that follow-up support to ensure sustainability for like a couple of years. And we always let survivors know, it doesn't matter if you're not our client anymore, always come back and if you need any type of support. There's a question in the chat. What guarantee do the victims have to ensure they will not be retaliated by immigration officers, law enforcement officers, especially when they are undocumented or their abusers are keeping their immigration papers? So I'm not sure. So here, Santa Clara County is a sanctuary county. And so law enforcement is not supposed to ask survivors about their legal status. And in fact, and all of the protections and provisions that are, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, that for victims of crime, they apply to victims of crime regardless of their legal status. So law enforcement should not be asking one. So all of the rights that apply regardless of somebody's legal status. And law enforcement should not be asking survivors about their legal status. And then in terms of immigration officers, I'm not quite sure what that means. So typically when somebody applies the U visa, T visa applications, they're sent out of state for the Department of Immigration to review and adjudicate. So I don't know if you have like a specific example that you can share. I'm happy to look at that. And then if survivors, if their partners are keeping their immigration papers, and I've had the situation happen multiple times where so once they're connected to the immigration attorney might have to do a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Immigration to request copies of the survivor's paperwork. So that's something that can be done as well. So I hope I answered your question. And that's the reason that we connect survivors to immigration attorneys. So they will have somebody that's going to represent them and support them through the entire process. So there shouldn't be any type of retaliation. I'm not quite sure. So if I didn't answer your question, I'm happy to talk more with you offline. Our victims with criminal records, DUI, drug charges, eligible for VAWA or U visa. They're under, for the U visa, for VAWA, I'd rather have an immigration attorney respond to that because I have processed very few VAWA cases. For U visas, there are certain crimes that are waivable with the U visa. And I need to, I mean, obviously being in the country without inspection is it's a crime, but it's waivable with U visa. I need to check about the drug charges and the DUI piece. So let me, and I think that the last, I thought we were also doing a presentation around collaboration. Is that accurate, Nikki? Because I know last time we did bring the immigration attorney to.
Yes. In a couple of months, we will be doing that.
Okay, awesome. So I'm happy to research that information and bring it back if that's helpful. And that's actually a really good question. So let me come and screenshot that, and then I'll check in with our immigration attorneys, and I will send the information to. I would also say I'd always encourage, please have your clients speak directly. Send them it's a free consultation, and they don't even have to come in person. They could do it through Zoom. And so if you're interested in a consultation, feel free to, you can email me. I'll put in my email in the chat, and I give you information so that you can refer folks to the Family Justice Center, because a lot of times what happens is that, so I have a law degree, but I'm not an attorney. And so I can't give advice. I've worked with a lot of survivors, but it's a lot of times you can't really give legal advice unless you have all of nuances of somebody's case. So I would really strongly recommend, if you have survivors or clients that you're working with, or family, whoever it is, refer them for a free consultation. And that way they can, the responses will be specific to that case. But I would always just refer, even if you're concerned that they might not qualify because they might have charges. It's better to refer and have the immigration attorney, because I know that we definitely have worked with survivors that have had different types of issues in their past. Okay, go on to the next one. So the other piece that we offer also is crisis intervention, and we are available 24/7 to provide, whether that's for crisis calls over the phone or in-person response. And we provide in-person response to the police departments. For domestic violence, we cover South Santa Clara County, so we will and San Benito. So we will respond to the police department from Morgan Hill, Gilroy, the South County sheriffs. We also respond to calls from the hospitals here in South County, emergency rooms, or we've had other situations where there's victims at the hospital and they don't want to go back home. So we get calls to respond and bring survivors to a safe location. We respond in person to schools, to the SAFE is the sexual assault forensic exam. And so survivors of intimate partner violence that were raped by their partner could also request a forensic exam for the sexual assault. And we also have, we also now have the intimate partner violence strangulation program. So when a survivor is strangled by their partner, whether it's law enforcement or an advocate that refers that survivor to this exam, the exam happens at Valley Medical Center. An advocate can be there with the survivor. So the advocate would be there the entire time. And those exams, whether it's a sexual assault forensic exam or an intimate partner violence forensic exam, those exams can last like 4 to 6 hours, sometimes more. And an advocate will be them during that entire time. We also provide accompaniment to the adult sexual assault exams. They're used, well, there's under VAWA, there's the ability for survivors of sexual assault that don't want to report the sexual assault, but want to preserve the evidence, because it's a very small window when somebody's sexually assaulted, when they can have that the forensic exam and preserve that evidence. And a lot of times survivors, because the majority of the cases of sexual assault, the victim knows their perpetrator, and especially if we're talking about a domestic violence case, often survivors don't want to bring in law enforcement yet. And so there's an ability for survivors to have a non-investigative rape kit, also known as a Jane Doe exam, where they'd go into Valley Medical Center, explain that they're a sexual assault survivor and that they want to have a non-investigative rape kit or a Jane Doe exam. And so then the nurses would do the entire exam, offer any type of medical care that the survivor may need, and then that evidence is preserved for up to 2 years, at which time the survivor has that time to decide whether they want to move forward. There's some funky stuff happening in our county in terms of because there was such so I would offer, before you offer to a survivor to have that an anonymous exam, also link them to a confidential advocate. And if the survivor just shows up at Valley Medical Center, our protocol is that the nurses would call a confidential advocate anyway. But it's just really important because it's such a nuanced exam that sometimes it's hard for survivors to have their needs met without some advocacy. Now in Santa Clara County, all of the sexual assault exams for children 12 and under are happening at the Child Advocacy Center. I don't know if everybody's aware of the Child Advocacy Center, that actually we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary. And this Child Advocacy Center is a place now where all children that have suffered any type of abuse can be brought to. It could be physical abuse, sexual abuse, severe emotional abuse or neglect. And that's one location where kids are brought in and can receive all of that support, as opposed to having to go to different law, because all of the interviews with children happen there as well. And if you don't have the information for the Child Advocacy Center, I'm also happy to pass that on. And then with the human trafficking operations, we also provide crisis intervention and in-person response. And that's whether it's one individual survivor identified or if it's a multi-victim operation. And we'll talk more about that when we come back to talk about human trafficking specifically. The other piece, a very important component of our services is peer counseling. So this is support, trauma-informed support that's provided by non-therapists, non-clinicians. And peer counseling is confidential. Really, our focus is to help the survivor increase their protective factors, identify coping strategies to overcome the trauma that they endured or perhaps are continuing to endure. Safety planning is really important. And we also do goal planning with survivors. And this is really to help survivors identify what are the priorities that they want to work on. And the goal plans are usually like for every 3 to 6 months. And also in the goal plan is identified what are the pieces that the advocate's going to work on, what are the pieces that the survivor is going to work on to make sure that those goals are moving forward. And the peer counseling is really a safe space to discuss feelings for survivors and normalizing our emotions or any or behaviors that survivors are struggling with. We talked about accompaniment. That's also a big part of the role that we do. And so again, going with survivors, interviews with law enforcement, prosecutors, victim witness. We also transport survivors to meetings with their attorneys, although we can't sit in because of attorney-client privilege. But sometimes they want us to go with them and just for the accompaniment or transportation piece. Any kind of court dates that are associated with the survivor's case, we would accompany them. And then any type of meetings that they might have with social services. We've also done accompaniment, again, because of HIPAA or the confidentiality, we might not be able to go in when the survivor has a medical appointment, but we go with them and help prep them for that meeting, and then are able to be with them coming back home. Advocacy is a huge piece. So we provide advocacy for survivors with victim witness, with social services around immigration issues. And that, again, typically with the immigration attorneys, any type of criminal justice support, and then restraining orders support. And as needed by survivors, there's, because of the housing programs now, that housing advocacy is a big piece of the work that we do as well. And also advocacy to ensure that survivors are getting resources or support that they need with other community-based organizations or governmental organizations. So some of the resources and referrals that we can offer, again, the Family Justice Center. So in Santa Clara County, there are 3 Family Justice Centers. One is operated in Community Solutions at our Morgan Hill office every Wednesday. I believe the one in San Jose is run out of Asian Americans for Community Involvement, their Story Road office on Thursdays. And then the YWCA runs the Family Justice Center in Sunnyvale on Fridays. And the purpose of a Family Justice Center is to have a place for co-located services, so that survivors don't have to come to Community Solutions for advocacy services. Then they have to go to the police department, then the victim witness, and the DA's office, a family law attorney, immigration attorney. All the services are here co-located. Our partners are here either on site or remotely every Wednesday. Survivors don't need to make an appointment. They could just come in. And the other piece that's really important, and the reason that we push to have the Family Justice Center operated out of Community Solutions office, is that it's confidential. If a survivor comes in, first they'll meet with a confidential advocate, and they'll only be linked to other resources like family law attorneys, law enforcement, et cetera, if that's what the survivor wants. If the survivor only comes in and talks, only wants to talk to an immigration, family law attorney, and an advocate, then the fact that they were even here, nobody's going to find out about it. So that piece has been really helpful. We've seen a lot of traction, a lot of traffic in our Family Justice Center. And through the Family Justice Center, we serve an average of like 25 people per week. And that's just, we're only open one day. We're really trying to move towards opening 2 days a week. And that way we're able to support more community members. The other resources and referral that we can offer and link survivors to is housing and emergency shelter, and mental health services, clothing, and food. And in terms of housing, I can share with all of you that the CDAW task force wrote a report on housing for survivors of gender-based violence. And it's a huge concern. So this is definitely an area that there's a lot of work being done. And the fastest growing number of homeless, of individuals that are homeless are victims of domestic violence, and particularly women and children. In Santa Clara County, there's only 4 agencies that provide emergency confidential shelter for survivors of domestic violence. And there's only 62 domestic violence specific beds available in the county. And so we've really had to prioritize those beds for survivors that are actively fleeing an abusive relationship or situation. So I know there's a lot of frustration when perhaps you've had that experience of wanting to have your client that you're working with brought into emergency shelter, and that the shelters are at capacity. And the reason that they're at capacity often is, one, there's only 62 beds that are specific, and that includes the beds for adults and children. Like our shelter, we have capacity for 14 individuals. And then the other reason is that because of COVID, because of the lack of transitional housing, a lot of times survivors are staying in our shelter longer. And so it's definitely a challenge. And I would recommend, so the question of how long can an inter-partner violence victim stay in a DV shelter? Every shelter runs differently. I would say the average stay is 30 to 60 days. And we really try to work with each survivor based on their individual circumstances. And so if a survivor, perhaps, there's other factors that come into play where they need to stay at our shelter for 2.5 months, maybe 3 months, we're going to work with that survivor individually. So it really does depend. But one thing that I will say is that the shelters do try to work with every survivor so that there's a plan for that survivor to, once their time is up at the shelter, so that they're not doing what we used to call the shelter shuffle, where they're going from our shelter to Aki's to next door. And we're working very closely with the Office of Supportive Housing and Office of Gender-Based Violence Prevention. We're in the process of developing and finalizing a housing gaps analysis. So we really want to identify how many emergency shelter beds do we really need? Is it just that we're turning people away because our clients are staying longer because they don't have a transitional housing program to go into? Or what really is the need? If you are in a situation where you're trying to if the shelter doesn't have capacity and you have a client that's actively, they're fleeing an abusive situation, they're in danger, I would always push to, if there isn't capacity, push to see if that shelter can hotel the client, because the majority of the DV shelter programs, we receive emergency hotel money. So if there's a survivor from South County, Morgan Hill, Gilroy, San Martin, and we don't have capacity at our shelter, we will bring that person into a hotel. And then for community solutions, I mentioned we have 14 beds specifically for domestic violence survivors. We had to repurpose one of our conference room at the shelter into a room for human trafficking survivors, so that we weren't taking capacity away from the domestic violence survivors. Usually human trafficking survivors will stay in our shelter for an average of a year. And we've had survivors stay up to 2 years. And again, it's not ideal. It's for many reasons, it's not ideal. And the only reason that we've had to do that is because there isn't any transitional housing. There's just nowhere else for survivors to go, unless we want to be sending them to one shelter after another after another. So it's a question: if they're in a shelter, can they get help with housing, human trafficking? So we do have 3 agencies in our county. There's 4 agencies that provide emergency shelter: Next Door Solutions, Domestic Violence, Community Solutions, Asian Americans for Community Involvement, and Next Door. And I have their information in this presentation. So all 4 of these shelters will bring in survivors of human trafficking if there's an intersection with domestic violence. And there's some shelters like Community Solutions, Aki, and the YW will bring in human trafficking survivors alone, like just because they're survivors of human trafficking. And once somebody comes into our shelter, a human trafficking survivor, they're also assigned a human trafficking caseworker. So if you're working with a survivor in a housing program that's a human trafficking survivor, they don't have to come into our housing program to be connected to an advocate to provide advocacy and support, if that's the question that you're asking. So hopefully I responded. And all the survivors that we work with, we do complete the VI-SPDAT and work with them to try to support for them to get into long-term housing. think I'm gonna have a little bit more information. So here we talk about the VI-SPDAT. I think all of you are familiar with that. We do have a confidential queue that was developed by the Domestic Violence Advocacy Consortium and the Continuum of Care. And so it shared that, you know, that the hopefully all the housing providers we've trained hundreds to use the condensed victim needs screening tool so that they're able to link potential victims to confidential resources for that immediate support. And these are the service providers in our county. So I have the Asian Americans for Community Involvement, and then the services that they provide, as well as the area that they cover and the language. And again, I'm going to send out this, you can take a screenshot, but you should also have a copy of this presentation. So this is all for domestic violence services. These are all the agencies that provide domestic violence services. All 5 agencies came together to form the Domestic Violence Advocacy Consortium back in 2003 as well. Okay. And we work very closely with our sister agencies, but there's also an opportunity for all of you if you want to refer survivors to any of the agencies and you want to do a warm handoff, or if you want to request an in-person response. And with regards to an in-person response, again, I can't speak for the other agencies, but for Community Solutions, we would provide an in-person response if you're working with somebody and that person it needs urgent support and they're not able to, come to our office. We're happy to have somebody come and meet with them in a private space at your location. So for intimate partner violence, these are the agencies that provide support. And then there's 2 sexual assault service providers in our county, and we're also domestic violence and human trafficking service providers, and that's Community Solutions and the YWCA. Okay, and so again, there's 2 rape crisis centers in Santa Clara County, the YWCA, and this is their main address and their crisis line. We'll spend more time talking about the services offered to sexual assault survivors. And for Community Solutions, it's our 24-hour crisis line and our main office address as well. So for human trafficking, we have a little bit of a different system. When we started working with, and again, we're going to go into detail when we provide the human trafficking presentation in a couple of weeks. But we do have a point agency system. And this system we implemented back in 2004 to make sure that survivors don't fall between the cracks. So through the point agency system, this can be activated for one of 3 purposes. One could be that their law enforcement, a community-based organization, a hospital needs an in-person response. They can call our crisis line. Community Solutions is a point agency and ensure a 1-hour in-person response for a survivor. The other is if there's a survivor that's in immediate need of some type of shelter, food, transportation, accompaniment, they could be referred through our point agency system. They will refer to Community Solutions, and then Community Solutions works with our sister agencies to assign an advocate that meets the linguistic, cultural needs of the survivor, or maybe their geographic needs. And also that could be for urgent or non-urgent support as well. Just an example of our point agency form. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this because you'll have a whole presentation on human trafficking and the process and services for that piece. Our contact information again for Community Solutions. And this is a space for questions. And I saw that there's some questions in the chat, so I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for questions. And if there's anything in the entire presentation that I went through too fast, please feel free now to ask the question. You could either put it in the chat or you could unmute yourself. Oh, you want me to share the previous screen again? Is that the one with the resources? Is it this one that you want to see, or the one with all the agencies? I'm gonna put it back to the one with all the agencies because I think that one's helpful. Okay, so there's a question about the safety risk for shelter staff. Kudos to them. Yeah, so all of the domestic violence shelters are confidential. The location's confidential, and it's actually a misdemeanor for anybody to knowingly disclose the location of a confidential shelter. And that's one way that we try to really ensure that the safety for our staff and our app and our clients. And so we do share with clients. I mean, the one thing is that, and every shelter is different. So there are some shelters like our shelter is set up as it's basically a duplex. And we have, half of the shelter is the staff quarters and the other half is the client quarters. And so we don't have security on site. We have security cameras, all those pieces. And there's other shelters like the YW that actually they have an apartment complex. So they do have a security guard that's there on site. So I think that they definitely take a lot of safety precautions. Survivors, if they do have transport, if they do have a car, we ask that they not park it anywhere near the shelter. Prior to bringing in somebody to the shelter as well, we identify if their abuser lives or works close to the area where a shelter is. And if they do, then we would help them go into a different, work with our sister organization so that they can go into a different shelter. The safety planning, again, is super important. And we've also developed very close relationships with the law enforcement agencies that serve the area where the shelter is located. So we know that at any time, if we need any support, we can call the law enforcement and they'll be there really quickly. Oh, you can't see my screen? Are you able to see the?
No, it isn't.
Oh, let me try again. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just for that. Okay. So again, I just wanted to create the spaces. I think Isaita's still here. I don't know if there's any questions for Isaita. I'm happy to interpret. I know that's a lot of information, so I just want to make sure that we have some space here to have this conversation and make sure that I'm answering any questions you might have. Isaita?
Sí, Perla.
No sé si hay algo que tú quieras compartir con las personas si algo que quieras compartir acerca de cómo pueden mejor apoyar a víctimas de violencia doméstica. So I'm asking Isaita if she wants to share any words of wisdom on how to best support survivors of intimate partner violence. Y te puedo interpretar.
Sí, he hecho para ayudar a las personas, pues siempre recomiendo, ¿verdad? En la agencia, porque yo nomás pues les puedo ayudar como intérprete, pero pues ahí está la agencia, ahí está el número de teléfono de 24 horas del crisis y ya con eso pues ya es una gran ayuda para ellos, para las personas que son bien necesitadas y para las personas también que quieran hacer preguntas para migración y otras las que uno no puede y ahí está la agencia para ellos.
Isaita is saying that she knows that the support that she can offer, which is really important support, is limited. So what she really encourages survivors to call Community Solutions, the crisis line, for additional support and resources. And she also encourages survivors to talk to the Step Forward immigration attorneys if they have any questions about any immigration questions. Isaita also is amazing, and she will transport survivors all the way from Hollister to our Morgan Hill office for a Family Justice Center day so that they can meet with advocates, with immigration attorneys, with family law attorneys. Okay, so again, let me see. There's a couple of things in the chat, and I don't. Oh, good question. So the question is, since we're trying to steer away from the term domestic violence when referring to intimate partner violence or intimate partner abuse, what is the best Spanish translation where we say violencia entre parejas íntimas? That's a really interesting one. I think that we've had a harder time using that term in Spanish, but we usually will say violencia entre pareja or violencia doméstica. And we'll explain to survivors when we say what it means, that it means basically the same thing. Like, and we try to stay away also from violencia entre pareja íntima, because a lot of times, like particularly like for teen dating situations, they, when we say íntima, that has a different connotation. So yeah, I think that survivors have been responsive to both violencia doméstica, violencia de pareja. Okay, cool. I don't see any other questions, so I'm gonna turn it back to Nikki, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Thank you so much, Perla and Sarah, for that. I'm sure everyone learned so much today. We want to remind you to please join us again on Thursday. That's when Community Solutions will really be taking a deep dive and covering sexual assault and human trafficking. So it's going to be the same way where you access the link through your Bridge portal now that you've registered. We also just want to remind you, I've popped it in the chat and I'll pop it in again. Just to take a couple moments to fill out our feedback form. It really helps us tailor our trainings year after year, to get you the content that you want to learn more about. So we'd really appreciate if you fill that out. And as I said, we have these 2 live trainings by Community Solutions, and then we have those 2 courses with the checkpoints. And please feel free to email us at, I will pop in the address right now, sccbridge@homebase.com. Homebase.org if you have specific issues or questions about the Bridge software and how to get through certain steps. I'd be happy to talk through those. So email us there. Otherwise, we are happy to give you 6 or 5 minutes back in your day. And thank you once again, Perla and